Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Miranda Kelshow, and 6 months ago, I would have told you that the worst thing about cartography was the tedium. The endless hours cross-referencing coordinates, the eye strain from examining satellite imagery, the professional isolation that comes with spending most of your working life staring at screens in a converted bedroom office. I was wrong. The worst thing about cartography is discovering that some places resist being mapped, that they have their own ideas about boundaries, their own preferences about who finds them and when. The worst thing about cartography is learning that maps don't just represent reality. Sometimes they shape it. I'd been freelancing for nearly 7 years when Hendrik Voss contacted me. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, unremarkable in every way except for the sender's domain. A series of numbers and letters that my spam filter should have caught but somehow hadn't. The subject line read simply, "Cartographic consultation urgent." I almost deleted it. I'd been getting more spam than legitimate work inquiries lately, a consequence of having my contact information listed on too many freelancer aggregator sites. But something about the formality of the phrasing, the lack of obvious commercial intent, made me open it. The message itself was brief, almost curt. Hendrik identified himself as a legal representative for a property management firm handling a complex estate settlement in rural Vermont. They required detailed topographic maps of a roughly 1,500-acre parcel that seemed to be missing from both current and historical surveys. The property had buildings, roads, and clear evidence of long-term habitation, yet it existed in what he called a documentation gap, present in some records, absent from others, its boundaries uncertain and disputed. He needed someone to survey the land, create comprehensive maps, and provide expert testimony if the matter went to court. The fee he quoted was triple my usual rate, with half paid up front. I should have questioned the urgency. I should have asked why a property management firm couldn't access standard survey records, why they needed someone immediately, why they were willing to pay so much. But I'd been scrambling for work since losing my contract with the State Environmental Agency 3 months earlier, and my savings were approaching critically low levels. The kind of low where you start having anxious conversations with yourself about whether to pay the full insurance premium or hope nothing catastrophic happens before you find stable income again. The kind of low where a single good contract could buy you breathing room for months. I responded within an hour. By that evening, I had a contract in my inbox, the actual ink signature kind, scanned and sent as a PDF, which seemed both antiquated and somehow more legitimate than the electronic signature systems most of my clients used. By the following Monday, I had half the payment in my account and directions to the property. The drive from my apartment in Burlington took nearly 4 hours, following Interstate 91 south before cutting west into increasingly rural territory. March in Vermont meant the landscape existed in that transitional state between winter and spring. The snow mostly melted except for stubborn patches in deep shadow, the trees still bare enough to see through. I'd driven through plenty of rural Vermont before. My work frequently took me to remote areas, but there was something about this particular stretch of road that felt progressively more isolated as I continued. The houses became sparser, their maintenance increasingly questionable. Hand-painted signs advertised maple syrup, firewood, and services with disconnected phone numbers. Several had been updated with the same odd addendum spray-painted in black: closed March-April. According to my GPS, I should have reached the property's entrance around 2 in the afternoon. Instead, I found myself driving the same 15-mile stretch of county road 3 times, my navigation system insisting I'd arrived even as I passed nothing but unbroken forest and the occasional collapsed barn. The landmarks Hendrik had provided in his email, a stone culvert, a lightning-struck oak with a triple trunk, a rusted grain silo, simply weren't present where they should have been. Or perhaps they were present at different times, because on my 4th pass, the culvert appeared exactly where it should have been, right where I'd looked 3 times before and seen only a standard roadside drainage pipe. I pulled over, checked my equipment. I'd brought my professional-grade GPS unit, a backup handheld model, my DSLR with multiple lenses, a drone for aerial photography, surveying equipment, a tablet loaded with topographic software, and enough batteries and backup power to run everything for days. The coordinates Hendrik had provided were clear, unambiguous. I entered them again, watched as my GPS unit calculated the route. According to the device, I was currently sitting less than half a mile from the main entrance. The road Hendrik had described, unmarked, unpaved, splitting off from the county highway between the culvert and the oak, wasn't visible. But when I drove another 100 yards and looked back in my rearview mirror, I could see it clearly, a gap in the trees that definitely hadn't been there moments before. I stopped, reversed carefully, and this time the road remained visible as I approached. The entrance was partially obscured by overgrown brush, the kind of wild vegetation that suggested decades of neglect. Yet when I got close enough to examine it, the road itself looked recently maintained. The gravel was fresh, free of the kind of embedded growth and erosion patterns you'd expect from an abandoned access road. I turned onto the property road with a peculiar sensation building in my chest, something I couldn't quite classify as anxiety or anticipation. The trees closed in overhead almost immediately, their bare branches creating complicated patterns against the overcast sky. The road curved gently but consistently, never allowing a line of sight more than 50 or 60 yards ahead. My GPS unit continued to insist I was approaching my destination, but the estimated distance kept adjusting. 3/10 of a mile, then 4/10, then back to 2/10, as if the property itself was uncertain about how far away it wanted to be. After what felt like several miles, but according to my odometer was only 7/10 of a mile, the trees opened onto what should have been the main compound. I say should have been because the buildings I saw didn't entirely match the descriptions Hendrik had provided. He'd mentioned a farmhouse, several outbuildings, and what he called ancillary structures from the property's period of institutional use in the mid-20th century. What I found was far more extensive. The farmhouse stood at the center of the clearing, a massive Victorian structure that looked simultaneously abandoned and occupied. The architecture was correct for the late 1800s, asymmetrical facade, tower elements, wraparound porch, decorative woodwork under the eaves. But the state of preservation was inconsistent. The eastern wing showed advanced deterioration, windows broken, paint completely weathered away, portions of the roof collapsed. The western wing appeared recently maintained, glass intact, what looked like relatively fresh paint, gutters properly attached. The division between the two conditions wasn't gradual. It occurred along a precise vertical line, as if someone had drawn a boundary with a ruler and decreed that decay could proceed on one side but not the other. I parked in what seemed to have been a gravel parking area, though the gravel was mixed with grass in a way that suggested simultaneous use and disuse. Before getting out, I spent several minutes examining the scene through my windshield, taking preliminary photographs, trying to understand what I was seeing. Beyond the main house stood at least a dozen other structures scattered across what must have been 40 or 50 acres of cleared land. Some I could identify: a barn, a carriage house, several smaller outbuildings that might have been workshops or storage sheds. Others defied easy classification. One appeared to be a water tower, except it was built entirely from wood and its proportions were wrong, too tall and narrow, almost sculptural. Another might have been a chapel or meeting house, but it had no windows, just smooth walls punctuated by a single elaborate doorway. The light had changed since I'd entered the property road. It was still afternoon. My dashboard clock insisted it was only 2:47, but the quality of illumination suggested late evening, that particular gray flatness that comes in the hour before sunset. I checked my phone. No signal, which wasn't surprising given the remote location, but the time on my phone didn't match my dashboard clock. According to my phone, it was 5:23. I reset my phone's clock, assuming it had glitched. Got out of my car. The temperature was wrong. I'd been driving with my windows cracked, comfortable in the 45-degree afternoon. The air here felt at least 20 degrees colder, cold enough that my breath formed visible clouds. Yet there was no wind, no movement of air at all, which should have made the temperature feel warmer rather than colder. The silence was equally unnatural. No bird calls, no insect sounds, none of the ambient noise you expect in a rural setting. Just my footsteps on the gravel and the metallic ticking of my car's cooling engine. I approached the main house, camera in hand, taking photographs as I walked. Through the viewfinder, the building looked different than it did with my naked eye. More decayed, more complete, sometimes both simultaneously. I took 3 shots of the front entrance, and when I reviewed them on the camera's display screen, each image showed the doorway in a different state. In the first, the door was closed, dark wood with peeling varnish and a tarnished brass handle. In the second, the door was open, revealing a shadowed interior. In the third, there was no door at all, just an open door frame with blackness beyond. I lowered the camera and looked at the house directly. The door was closed, definitely, unambiguously closed. Professional curiosity is a dangerous thing. It compels you forward even when instinct suggests retreat. I'd built my career on being thorough, on documenting details others missed, on spending whatever time was necessary to get the complete picture. So I approached the house, climbed the 3 steps to the porch, noting that the wood felt solid under my feet despite visible rot, and tried the door handle. It turned easily, and the door swung inward with a sound like breath being released. The interior should have been dark. The windows I could see from outside were either broken or filmed with decades of grime. But the foyer was illuminated by what seemed to be natural light, though I couldn't identify its source. The space was larger than the exterior dimensions suggested it should be, a common perceptual trick in old houses with complex floor plans, but this went beyond the usual architectural illusion. I could see hallways extending in 4 directions from the central foyer, each one longer than the house's width. Furniture remained in place, arrangements that suggested the house had been abandoned mid-use rather than deliberately emptied. A coat rack near the entrance held garments that appeared simultaneously ancient and recently worn, wool coats with styles from different decades, a modern rain jacket hanging beside a Victorian-era cloak. Mail sat on a hall table, envelopes yellowed with age but addressed with contemporary postal codes. A grandfather clock stood against one wall, its pendulum motionless, its hands missing entirely, just empty mounting posts where they should have been. I'd learned early in my career to document everything, to trust my equipment more than my perception when the two conflicted. I raised my camera and began systematically photographing the interior, working from left to right, maintaining the professional discipline that had served me well in previous challenging assignments. Through the viewfinder, I saw the same space, but somehow more of it. Details my eyes had skipped over suddenly becoming visible and significant. Photographs on the walls that I hadn't consciously noticed. Doorways that seemed to appear only when I wasn't looking directly at them. Shadows that fell from the wrong angles, suggesting light sources that didn't exist. In the hallway extending to my left, I found evidence of the property's institutional period. Hendrick's email had mentioned that the property had served various functions over its history: private residence, sanitarium, educational facility, government research station. But he'd been vague about the specifics and timeline. The hallway walls were painted in that particular shade of institutional green that immediately marks a space as having been used for medical or governmental purposes. The kind of green that exists solely because someone, somewhere, once decided it was calming or official, or simply because they'd ordered too much of it. Brass placards were mounted beside doorways at regular intervals, their engravings worn but readable. Assessment Room 3, Observation Station B, processing authorized personnel only. I opened the door to Assessment Room 3. The space beyond was small, perhaps 10 feet square, empty except for a metal table bolted to the floor and two chairs, one on either side of the table. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust except for the chair facing the door, which was spotless, as if someone had just stood up from it. On the table sat a file folder, manila colored, new enough that the edges were still crisp. I approached it with the kind of caution you develop when too many things don't add up. When your professional training insists you should document, but your instinct suggests you shouldn't touch. The folder contained forms, medical assessment forms, psychological evaluation checklists, documents with official seals from agencies I didn't recognize. All of them were blank except for a single field at the top of each page, subject name. And in that field, written in different hands, sometimes typed, sometimes printed by what must have been a dot matrix printer based on the characteristic letter spacing, was my name, Miranda Kelshaw. Over and over again, across dozens of pages, my name appeared where a patient or subject identifier should have been. I should have left then, taken my photographs, returned to my car, driven back to the county road, and called Hendrik Voss to inform him that I couldn't complete the assignment. But the documents felt less like a threat and more like a mistake, a strange coincidence that had an explanation I simply couldn't see yet. Someone had used template forms and accidentally left a name field populated. The name happened to match mine. Vermont wasn't a large state. There might be other Miranda Kelshaws. The probability wasn't zero. I photographed every page in the folder, then returned it to exactly the position I'd found it. Continued down the hallway, opening doors, finding more rooms in various states of preservation and use. An office with filing cabinets that opened to reveal meticulously organized records from the 1960s. Patient files for people with names that sounded generated rather than real. John Smith, Mary Johnson, Robert Williams, Linda Davis. Hundreds of them, their medical histories improbably similar. their discharge dates all falling within a 3-week period in March of 1967. A laboratory with equipment that looked simultaneously antique and advanced, glass beakers beside digital monitors, hand-cranked centrifuges next to electron microscopes, a dormitory with 20 narrow beds arranged in precise rows, each bed made with military precision, each pillow indented as if heads had just risen from them. At the end of the hallway, I found a door different from the others. Where the other doors were standard institutional models, solid, painted, with simple hardware, this one was constructed from much older wood, dark and heavy, with elaborate carved details depicting what might have been botanical illustrations or abstract patterns. The carving was deep enough that my fingers could trace the grooves, and when I did, I felt the wood was warm, noticeably warmer than the ambient temperature. The door had no handle, no visible hardware at all, but when I pushed gently, it swung open silently. The space beyond wasn't a room but a transition. I'd done enough architectural documentation to recognize the difference between a room and a passage, between a destination and a threshold. The doorway opened onto what appeared to be exterior space, trees, sky, the ground covered in that patchy late winter snow I'd seen during my drive. But the geometry was wrong. I was standing in an interior hallway on what I'd assessed as the ground floor of a 2-story building. Through the door, I should have seen the exterior wall of the house, or at most a few feet of clearance before hitting another structure. Instead, I was looking at what seemed to be miles of forest, the trees extending to a horizon that shouldn't have existed. I stepped through the doorway, one foot still in the hallway, ready to retreat if the passage proved unstable or illusory. The transition was seamless, no discontinuity, no sense of crossing a boundary. I was simply in the forest, standing on ground that felt solid and real, breathing air that smelled of pine and damp earth. When I turned around, the doorway remained visible behind me, still open, still showing the institutional hallway. But the house itself wasn't there. The doorway existed independently, a freestanding frame in the middle of the forest, the hallway visible through it like a window into a different location entirely. I've spent enough time in remote areas to have developed a reliable sense of direction, an intuitive understanding of how landmarks relate to each other, how to maintain orientation even when trails become unclear. That sense failed me here. The sun, or what appeared to be the sun, occupied a position in the sky that suggested late morning, though my watch insisted it was now 3:15. The shadows fell in multiple directions simultaneously, as if there were several light sources all casting their own independent shadows. When I tried to triangulate my position using the doorway as a reference point and identifiable landforms in the distance, the mathematics refused to resolve. I would need to be facing 3 different directions simultaneously for the angles to work. I photographed the doorway from multiple angles, documenting its freestanding nature, the visible hallway through the frame, the forest surrounding it. Through my viewfinder, I noticed details I'd missed with direct observation. Marks on the ground around the doorway's base, arrangements of stones that might have been natural or might have been deliberately placed, patterns in the tree growth that suggested clearing and regrowth in concentric rings centered on the doorway's position. The professional thing to do would have been to map this space, to document it thoroughly despite, or perhaps because of, its apparent impossibility. I'd been hired to survey the property, to create comprehensive maps, to establish boundaries and relationships between structures. The fact that the relationships appeared to violate normal spatial logic didn't change my assignment. It just made it more challenging, and, in a perverse way, more interesting. I built my reputation on handling difficult surveys, on bringing clarity to confused documentation, on producing maps that resolved ambiguous boundaries. This was simply the most extreme example I'd encountered. I spent the next 2 hours, according to my watch, though the sun barely moved, systematically photographing and measuring the area around the doorway. I documented the tree species, all native to Vermont but growing in combinations that suggested different planting periods or microclimate variations. I recorded GPS coordinates, though my unit couldn't establish a stable lock, the satellite signal fluctuating between full strength and complete loss every few seconds. I attempted to pace out distances, marking waypoints with bright survey tape, only to find that returning to a marked tree often meant walking a different distance than I'd recorded on the outbound journey. The forest itself seemed aware of my presence, not aware in an animated or aggressive sense, but aware the way a building can feel aware, the way you sometimes sense that a space is paying attention to you even though you can't articulate what that attention feels like. Trees that I'd passed moments before appeared in different locations when I glanced back. The density of undergrowth changed without my noticing the transition, thick enough to be nearly impassable one moment, mysteriously clear the next. Several times I saw movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that might have been deer or might have been something else, always disappearing before I could focus on them directly. I'd brought my drone, a professional-grade unit capable of high-resolution photography and reliable GPS-based navigation. I launched it from a small clearing near the doorway, watching on my tablet as it ascended through the canopy and leveled off at 300 feet. The aerial view should have provided clarity, a comprehensive perspective on the property layout. Instead, it deepened the mystery. The forest extended in all directions farther than my drone's range could capture, but embedded within it were structures, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scattered across what must have been thousands of acres. The main house with its compound of outbuildings was visible as a cleared area roughly west-northwest of my position, but there were other clearings, other building clusters, some of them vast. I could see what looked like entire institutional campuses, industrial complexes, residential developments, all of them apparently abandoned, all of them existing in that same state of simultaneous decay and preservation I'd observed in the main house. The property Hendrik had described was supposed to be 1,500 acres. From the drone's perspective, I was looking at something at least 10 times that size, possibly much larger. The boundaries were impossible to determine. The forest simply extended to the limits of visibility in every direction, and when I tried to make the drone follow a straight line to establish a property edge, it began exhibiting erratic behavior. The GPS coordinates jumped randomly, the compass heading spun without the drone turning, and the video feed showed the same landscape repeating in loops, as if I was flying in circles despite the drone's insistence that it was maintaining a straight course. I brought the drone back carefully, manually controlling its return when the automated navigation failed. It landed roughly, one of its rotor arms catching on a low branch, but it was intact enough to retrieve the data. When I reviewed the footage later, much later after everything else had happened, I would notice details I'd missed during the live monitoring. Figures visible in some of the clearings, too distant to identify but clearly human or human-shaped. Vehicles on roads that shouldn't exist. Lights visible in buildings that appeared otherwise completely abandoned. And in several frames, barely visible in the tree line, watching the drone's progress, Faces. Not animal faces. Not quite human faces either. Something that had learned how to arrange features in approximately the right configuration, but hadn't entirely grasped the underlying principles. By the time I returned through the freestanding doorway to the institutional hallway, the quality of light inside had changed again. It was darker, with illumination coming from sources I still couldn't identify. Not bright enough to cast definite shadows, but bright enough to navigate by. The hallway seemed longer than I remembered, the door to the foyer now distant enough that I couldn't quite make out details. I walked back toward the entrance, counting my steps, trying to establish a baseline measurement. According to my count, the hallway was nearly 300 feet long. According to the exterior dimensions of the house I'd observed before entering, it should have been less than 50. The foyer, when I reached it, was no longer empty. Something, had been there during my absence. The mail on the hall table had been sorted, arranged in neat stacks organized by some principle I couldn't determine. Fresh mud on the floor marked a trail from the front door to the hallway I just exited. Footprints in what appeared to be work boots, the tread pattern clear and recent. The coat rack had gained additional garments, including a windbreaker that looked disturbingly similar to the one I was wearing, though I was definitely still wearing mine. I left through the front door, relieved to find my car exactly where I'd parked it. The light outside suggested evening now, consistent with neither my watch, which showed 5:47, nor the position of the sun, which seemed to have barely moved since my arrival. I loaded my equipment back into the vehicle, moving quickly, trying not to appear as unsettled as I felt. Professional composure is partly genuine capability and partly performance, and I'd gotten good at the performance aspect over years of dealing with difficult clients and challenging site conditions. But this property was testing limits I hadn't known existed. I should have left then, driven back to the county road, returned to Burlington, informed Hendrik Voss that the property was unsurveyable, that its spatial relationships were too ambiguous to map accurately. But I'd already spent a day, already collected thousands of images and hours of documentation. And more than that, I'd begun to understand that this place operated according to rules that weren't immediately apparent but might be discoverable through careful observation. Every map begins with a mystery, inaccurate existing documentation, disputed boundaries, features that don't match historical records. This was simply a more extreme version of problems I'd solved before. Different in degree, perhaps, but not in kind. I decided to establish a base of operations in one of the outbuildings rather than drive off the property each night. The structure I chose had apparently been a caretaker's cottage at some point. Small, one-story, relatively intact, with what appeared to be a working wood stove and furniture that, while old, seemed solid enough to use. The windows were intact. The roof didn't leak when I tested it with a garden hose I found coiled outside, and the door had a lock that still functioned. I brought in my camping gear, set up my laptop and charging station powered by portable batteries, and arranged my equipment for easy access. The cottage had electricity, though I couldn't trace the power lines to any obvious source. The outlets worked, delivering standard voltage according to my testing equipment, current flowing from somewhere I couldn't identify through wiring that seemed to date from the 1940s. That first night, I began organizing my documentation, importing photographs from my camera, reviewing drone footage, trying to construct a preliminary map from the data I'd collected. The process revealed inconsistencies I'd missed in the field. Photographs I'd taken in sequence, standing in one position and rotating to capture a panoramic view, didn't align when I tried to stitch them together. Features visible in one image were absent or relocated in adjacent images. The compass heading embedded in each photo's metadata showed impossible variations. Magnetic north seemed to shift by as much as 90 degrees between shots taken seconds apart from the same location. I worked until well past midnight, or what my devices insisted was midnight, though the darkness outside never deepened beyond a certain twilight dimness. Around 2 in the morning, I became aware of sounds outside the cottage, footsteps on the gravel path, the creak of the porch boards, sounds that might have been voices but were too distorted by distance or intervening materials to parse as language. I turned off my laptop screen, sat in darkness, listened. The sounds continued for perhaps 20 minutes, circling the cottage in what seemed like a systematic pattern, as if someone was conducting their own survey, documenting the building's features, recording its dimensions and condition. Eventually, the sounds receded, moving off toward other structures in the compound. In the morning, and I'm using morning to mean the time when my watch showed 7:00 a.m., not any particular change in ambient light, I found evidence of overnight activity throughout the compound. Structures I'd photographed the previous day had changed, not dramatically but distinctly. The barn had gained a fresh coat of red paint on its eastern wall. The water tower's proportions had shifted subtly, becoming slightly less wrong. Several of the outbuildings I couldn't classify had relocated entirely, now standing in positions separated from their previous locations by distances ranging from a few yards to several hundred feet. When I reviewed my photographs from the previous day and compared them to new images I took that morning, the changes were undeniable. But when I tried to document the changes by placing the images side by side, they began to look more similar than they had initially, as if the property was retroactively adjusting my documentation to match its current configuration. I spent the second day attempting to survey the property boundaries, to establish where this place ended and normal Vermont began. I hiked outward from the main compound in each cardinal direction, marking my path with GPS waypoints and physical markers, surveyors' flags tied to trees, spray paint marks on rocks, cairns built at regular intervals. In theory, I should have been able to reach the property boundary within a few hours in any direction. A 1,500-acre plot is roughly 2.33 square miles, which meant I should have been able to walk from center to edge in an hour or less. I never found an edge. Heading north, I walked for 5 hours according to my watch, maintaining as straight a course as the terrain permitted, before abandoning the attempt. My GPS unit showed I'd covered nearly 8 miles, though the waypoints I'd dropped formed a pattern that suggested I'd been walking in enormous loops. Heading east, I encountered the institutional complex I'd seen from the drone, a sprawling collection of buildings that looked like they'd been constructed in the 1950s for some governmental purpose. The architecture was brutally functional, concrete and steel, flat roofs, narrow windows, no decoration or aesthetic consideration. Signs identified some of the buildings: Administration, Research Facility 7, Containment, Central Processing. All of them were unlocked. All of them were simultaneously abandoned and recently occupied. Break rooms with fresh coffee in the pots, though the pots weren't plugged in and the coffee was cold enough to have been sitting for hours. Offices with papers on desks arranged as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. Laboratories with experiments in progress, beakers of colored liquid in various stages of reaction, centrifuges still spinning despite being unplugged from wall sockets. In one of the research buildings, I found a map room. The walls were covered with charts, surveys, topographic maps, aerial photographs, all apparently documenting this same property. Some of the maps were old enough that they'd yellowed and begun to deteriorate, their dates ranging from the 1920s through the 1960s. Others were recent, printed on modern paper with contemporary cartographic conventions. All of them showed different configurations, different boundaries, different internal features, different scales. One map from 1934 showed a compact 60-acre parcel with a single farmhouse and barn. A map from 1952 showed 1,200 acres with extensive institutional development. A map from 1978 showed only forest, no structures at all, no evidence of human presence. The most recent map, dated just 3 months earlier, showed the property as it currently appeared, or at least, as it had appeared when whoever made the map had surveyed it. But when I looked more closely, I noticed that even this recent map included features I hadn't encountered, buildings and roads in positions I hadn't visited yet, or possibly structures that existed only sometimes, only under certain conditions I hadn't learned to recognize. The map that troubled me most was tacked to a corkboard separate from the others, as if it had been set aside for special attention, or because it didn't fit with the rest of the collection. It showed the property at a scale of 1:10,000, professionally drafted, with precise boundary lines and comprehensive feature identification. The date in the legend was 3 weeks in the future, and in the lower right corner in the cartographer identification field was my name. I photographed everything in the map room, spending hours documenting each chart, each notation, each revision and correction marked in the margins. The most heavily annotated maps included warnings written in various hands, as if successive surveyors had added their observations over time. Verify all measurements twice. Property resists accurate assessment. Northern boundary shifts with observation. Do not map while alone. Some features exist only in documentation. The property has preferences about how it's represented, and written in fresher ink at the bottom of a 1967 survey. If you can read this, you're already part of it. Map what you can. Leave before you become a permanent feature. That evening, back at the cottage, I attempted to compile my documentation into a coherent preliminary map. The task should have been straightforward. Import GPS data, overlay photographs, identify features, establish relationships, begin drafting. Instead, I found myself unable to reconcile even basic spatial relationships. The main house appeared in my GPS data in multiple locations, sometimes separated by miles. The institutional complex I'd explored existed in my documentation in 3 different configurations, none of them entirely consistent with my memory of being there. My photographs showed structures I didn't remember seeing, and failed to show structures I distinctly recalled photographing. I worked through the night again, fueled by coffee from a tin I'd brought with me, and the kind of obsessive focus that sometimes overtakes me when a project becomes particularly challenging. The mapping software I used was sophisticated enough to handle unusual circumstances, non-standard projections, historical map reconciliation, GPS error correction. But it couldn't resolve contradictions this fundamental. Every attempt to create a coherent map resulted in features overlapping in impossible ways, roads intersecting at angles that violated geometry, buildings occupying the same space as other buildings, or as terrain features that couldn't coexist with structures. Around 3 in the morning, I made a decision that in retrospect seems like the moment everything shifted from unusual to irretrievable. I decided that if the property wouldn't conform to conventional mapping techniques, I would adapt my techniques to the property. I would map what I observed rather than what should be possible. I would document the contradictions rather than trying to resolve them. I would create a map that showed the property as it actually functioned, rather than as it theoretically should function. I started with the simplest element, the main house. I created a new file, imported all my photographs of the building, and began drafting a floor plan that included all the spaces I documented regardless of whether they fit within the structure's exterior dimensions. The foyer in the center, the hallway extending east, longer than the house's width, the institutional corridor running north-south, its length impossible to determine precisely, the dormitory, the laboratory, the assessment rooms, the mysterious carved door, and the freestanding doorway it opened onto. I drew them all, connecting them according to my experience of moving through the space rather than according to geometric logic. The resulting floor plan was impossible. It showed a building with interior spaces vastly exceeding its exterior volume, with hallways that extended past where walls should be, with rooms accessed through doorways that overlapped with other features. But it was accurate. It represented the space as I'd experienced it. It was a functional map of an impossible structure. Encouraged by this success, if success is the right word for accurately documenting the impossible, I expanded my approach to the entire property. I mapped the compound as a collection of features with defined relationships, but without committing to absolute positions. The barn is southwest of the main house, unless you approach from the north, in which case it's southeast. The water tower is visible from the cottage, but not from the main house, despite the cottage being closer to the main house than to the tower. The institutional complex is 8 miles east, or 3 miles, or directly accessible through certain doorways in the main house, depending on your method of approach. Over the following days, and I'd stopped trying to reconcile time measurements, accepting that my watch, my phone, and the actual passage of daylight measured different things here. I developed techniques for surveying impossible space. I learned that consistency mattered more than objective truth. If I approached a location the same way twice, I would find it in the same place. If I varied my approach, the location varied correspondingly. The property had rules, but they were rules about relationships and patterns, rather than rules about fixed positions and absolute measurements. I encountered other surveyors, not physically but through evidence of their presence. I would find equipment set up in clearings, tripods with laser measuring devices, GPS base stations, trail cameras activated but not recording. I would see footprints that weren't mine, fresh enough to be recent, too weathered to be fresh. I would discover survey markers, brass caps embedded in stone, wooden stakes with ribbons, spray-painted reference marks that hadn't been there hours before. Sometimes I would hear voices, distorted by distance or acoustics, calling out measurements or reading coordinates. But I never saw anyone else directly, never made contact despite following sounds that seemed close enough that I should have encountered their source. The cottage became my refuge and my workspace. I covered the walls with printouts of my photographs, connecting features with string, building a three-dimensional representation of spatial relationships that couldn't be rendered on a two-dimensional map. I compiled notebooks full of observations, trying to identify patterns in the property's behavior. I began to understand that it changed according to principles that were consistent even if they weren't normal. It preferred certain configurations. It responded to observation by becoming more definite in some ways and more ambiguous in others. It had, if not consciousness exactly, then at least something like preference or intention. One afternoon, my watch showed 4:15, which might have meant anything. I received an email from Hendrik Voss. My phone had no signal, shouldn't have been able to receive email, but the notification appeared nonetheless, the brief chime startling me out of my analysis of aerial photographs. The email was brief, characteristically formal. Progress update requested. Initial survey should be completed by now. Please confirm timeline for final deliverables and schedule for expert testimony preparation. I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to formulate a response that would convey the situation without sounding delusional. How do you explain to a legal representative that the property he hired you to map doesn't conform to normal spatial principles? That it's simultaneously 1,500 acres and potentially infinite? That structures relocate themselves overnight and interior spaces exceed exterior dimensions. I drafted and deleted 3 responses before settling on something professionally vague. Survey in progress. Property presents unusual documentation challenges requiring extended field work. Will provide detailed update within 1 week. His response came within minutes, which shouldn't have been possible given that my phone still showed no signal. Unusual challenges anticipated. That's why we contacted you specifically. Take whatever time necessary. Accuracy more important than speed. There was something in that phrasing, contacted you specifically, that suggested he knew more about the property's nature than his initial emails had indicated. I typed a follow-up question asking for clarification about what challenges he'd anticipated, but the message failed to send, my phone insisting I had no data connection despite having just received his email moments before. By the end of my second week on the property, measured by the number of sleep cycles I'd completed rather than by any reliable time measurement, I developed a working theory about what I was documenting. The property wasn't simply a place with unusual characteristics. It was a place where the normal relationship between space and documentation had inverted. Typically, maps represent territory that exists independently of the map. But here, the documentation seemed to have primacy over the physical reality. The property configured itself according to how it was being mapped, adjusting its features to match or deliberately contradict the surveyor's expectations and methods. This explained the conflicting historical maps I'd found in the map room. Each surveyor had found a different configuration because each surveyor had approached the documentation differently, and the property had responded by manifesting the version of itself that corresponded to their mapping methodology. The 1934 surveyor, expecting a simple farm, had found a simple farm. The 1952 surveyor, prepared to document an institutional complex, had found extensive institutional development. The 1978 surveyor, looking for evidence of abandonment, had found only forest, which raised an obvious question. What version of the property was I creating through my current survey work? By mapping it as a space with flexible relationships and context-dependent features, was I reinforcing those characteristics? Would my documentation make the property more unstable, more resistant to conventional mapping, more thoroughly impossible? I found partial answers in a journal I discovered in one of the outbuildings, a structure I'd initially classified as a workshop, but which revealed itself to be more like an archive. The building's interior was far larger than its exterior suggested. I'd stopped being surprised by such discrepancies, filled with filing cabinets and shelves holding decades worth of documentation about the property, personnel records from its institutional period, maintenance logs from its agricultural phase, research notes from its time as what appeared to be a government facility, and, scattered throughout, personal journals from previous surveyors and cartographers who'd attempted to map this place. The earliest journal I found dated from 1889, handwritten in elegant script in a leather-bound notebook. The surveyor, a man named Elias Thorne, had been hired to establish boundaries for what was then a recently purchased farm. His early entries were confident, professional, noting measurements and landmarks with precision. But as the survey continued, his observations became increasingly troubled. The eastern property line cannot be located with certainty. Each attempt to establish its position yields different results. I begin to suspect my equipment is faulty, though I have tested it thoroughly and found no defect. Later, I have measured the distance from the barn to the creek bed 6 times. The results range from 340 feet to 1,180 feet. I am certain of my methodology. The variability must be in the terrain itself, though I cannot explain how a fixed distance might fluctuate so dramatically. And finally, in an entry dated 3 months after his initial arrival, I will complete the survey by documenting what I observe rather than what should be observable. My map will be accurate in its own terms, even if those terms contradict conventional surveying principles. Perhaps future cartographers will develop techniques for representing such spaces. I can only hope they fare better than I have. The journal ended abruptly. The final entry was dated mid-sentence, the ink trailing off as if Elias had been interrupted mid-word and never returned to complete the thought. According to records I found elsewhere in the archive, he was never seen again after leaving the property. His completed survey was filed with the county but subsequently lost or misfiled, never appearing in official records despite being referenced in multiple documents. Other journals told similar stories. A surveyor in 1923 who documented the property's transformation from agricultural to institutional use, noting that buildings seemed to appear fully formed overnight, as if they'd always been there. A cartographer in 1955 who'd attempted to map the underground spaces, tunnels and basements that connected the institutional buildings, only to find that the underground geography was even more contradictory than the surface features. A GIS specialist in 1998 who tried to reconcile satellite imagery with ground-level surveys and concluded that the property exists in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously manifesting multiple configurations depending on how and when it's observed. Each journal eventually deteriorated into confusion, frustration, or acceptance of the impossible, and each surveyor seemed to have disappeared or suffered some unclear fate after leaving the property. The records were vague, resigned from the profession, relocated out of state, no longer contactable, status unknown. No clear pattern of harm, but a consistent pattern of departure followed by absence, as if mapping this place marked you in ways that made returning to normal professional life impossible. I should have left then. The journals made the danger clear enough. Not immediate physical danger, but something subtler and more insidious. This place changed the people who tried to document it. It drew you into its logic, made you complicit in its impossibility, turned you from observer into participant. But I'd never abandoned a project halfway through, had built my reputation on seeing difficult surveys to completion regardless of the challenges. And beyond professional pride, I developed a genuine curiosity about the property's nature. It was a puzzle, and I'd always been better at solving puzzles than walking away from them. I began exploring the property more systematically, visiting structures I'd only photographed from a distance, documenting features I'd noted but not investigated. The institutional complex yielded the most interesting findings. In one of the research buildings, I discovered laboratories that appeared to have been studying the property itself. Experiment logs detailed attempts to measure spatial anomalies, to identify patterns in the property's behavior, to develop theoretical frameworks for understanding how a place could resist conventional documentation. The researchers, their names were redacted from the documents, just empty spaces where identities should have been, had made significant progress. They'd identified what they called anchor points, locations within the property that remained stable even as everything around them shifted. They'd mapped confluence zones, where multiple spatial configurations overlapped, allowing access to different versions of the property simultaneously. They documented observer effects, where the act of measurement influenced the measured quantity more dramatically than quantum mechanics would suggest possible. One research note, dated 1964, included a diagram that looked like a conventional topographic map until you examined it closely and realized it was showing the same area from multiple perspectives simultaneously, as if space itself had been folded, and the folds represented on a flat surface. The note accompanying the diagram read, "Hypothesis: the property exists at a nexus of multiple spatial dimensions, with three-dimensional slices manifesting based on observer perspective and methodology. Mapping the property requires representing not just three spatial dimensions, but at least seven, including temporal and observational axes. Standard cartographic techniques are insufficient. Recommend development of new visualization methods specifically for impossible spaces." I spent 3 days, or what I experienced as 3 days, attempting to implement their recommendations, creating maps that represented the property in multiple dimensions simultaneously. I used layers in my mapping software to show different configurations, color coding to indicate observer-dependent features, annotations to explain context-sensitive relationships. The resulting maps were complex to the point of being nearly unreadable, but they were more accurate than conventional representations. They showed the property as it actually functioned rather than as simplified versions that omitted inconvenient impossibilities. During this period, I saw the figures more frequently. The presences I'd only glimpsed before became more obvious, more defined, though never quite solid enough to photograph clearly. They appeared at a distance, moving between buildings, standing in clearings, observing from tree lines. Human-shaped but not quite human in their proportions or movements. Sometimes they seemed to be conducting their own surveys, carrying equipment I almost recognized, taking measurements of structures I'd been documenting. Other times they simply stood and watched, facing in my direction with an attention that felt focused despite my inability to make out features at the distance that separated us. I tried to approach them several times. Each attempt failed in different ways. Once, I followed a figure into the barn, arriving seconds after it entered, only to find the interior empty and showing no evidence of recent occupation. Another time, I called out to a group of 3 figures standing near the water tower. They turned in my direction, seemed to register my presence, then simply faded, not disappearing instantly but becoming progressively more transparent until they were indistinguishable from the air itself. A third attempt ended with me losing an hour. I began walking toward a solitary figure at the edge of a clearing, and my next clear memory was standing in a different part of the property entirely, my watch showing that 63 minutes had passed, though I had no recollection of the interval. The cottage remained my safe space, though safe was becoming a relative term. At night again, night being a condition defined by my sleep cycle rather than by any consistent darkness, I would hear the sounds more clearly. Footsteps on the path outside, voices murmuring in what might have been conversation or might have been some other form of communication, occasional knocks on the door that I never answered. Once I woke to find muddy footprints on the floor leading from the door to the wall where I'd pinned my most recent map drafts, then back to the door, as if someone had entered while I slept, examined my work and left. The footprints were too large to be mine, the tread pattern unfamiliar. I began documenting the figures themselves, adding them to my maps as features of the property. I noted locations where I'd seen them, times when they appeared most frequently, patterns in their movements. They seemed drawn to places where spatial relationships were most ambiguous, where different configurations of the property overlapped. They avoided the anchor points that remained stable. They appeared more frequently when I was actively surveying, as if my documentation efforts attracted their attention or perhaps summoned them in some way. The map on the corkboard, the one dated 3 weeks in my future with my name as cartographer, began to trouble me more as I continued working. I checked it regularly, and each time I visited the map room it had changed. Not dramatically, but consistently. Features I'd recently documented appeared on it. Annotations I'd made in my own maps were reflected in its margins. It was as if the map was updating itself based on my work, or perhaps I was unconsciously recreating the map I'd seen, unable to deviate from a pattern I'd already observed in documentation from my own future. 3 weeks into my survey, my best estimate, given that time measurement had become thoroughly unreliable, I received another email from Hendrik Voss. Client growing impatient for final deliverables. Understand property presence challenges, but need commitment to completion date. How much additional time required? I tried to formulate an honest answer. The truth was that I could spend years mapping this property and never complete a definitive survey. But I could produce a useful map, something that represented the property's nature even if it couldn't claim to be comprehensive or final. I responded, 2 more weeks for field work, then 1 week for map finalization. Final deliverable will be unconventional but accurate. Client should be prepared for documentation that doesn't match standard survey formats. His response was immediate. Unconventional acceptable, accurate essential, proceed. Again, the implication that he understood what he was asking for, that my unconventional approach was expected rather than concerning. I redoubled my efforts, pushing deeper into areas of the property I'd previously avoided or been unable to access. I discovered a cemetery beyond the institutional complex, headstones marking graves for people with the same generated-sounding names I'd seen in the patient files. Hundreds of graves, all with death dates in March 1967, the same period when the patient discharge dates clustered. I found a radio tower at what should have been the northern boundary, its structure intact, but its equipment showing decades of weathering, still somehow transmitting a signal I could hear on my portable radio. Just static and occasional fragments of voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. I located what appeared to be the property's original boundary markers, stone posts engraved with dates from the 1790s, but they were arranged in a pattern that didn't form a closed polygon, their positions suggesting a property line that overlapped itself in geometrically impossible ways. I documented roads that led nowhere, bridges over streams that didn't exist, paths that doubled back on themselves without actually turning. The deeper I went into the property's geography, the more I understood that it wasn't simply a place with unusual characteristics. It was a place that had been made unusual through some deliberate process. The institutional period hadn't just studied the spatial anomalies. It had created them, or amplified them, or perhaps both. The research I'd found wasn't observational but experimental. They'd been trying to manufacture impossible space, to create a location that could exist in multiple states simultaneously, to develop a place that resisted fixed documentation. The question was why? What practical application could there be for space that refused to be accurately mapped? I found partial answers in the more classified documents I discovered, files that should have been redacted or removed but had somehow remained accessible, project names with vague bureaucratic titles, operational geography modification, strategic cartographic ambiguity, defensive spatial uncertainty, reports discussing military applications for locations that couldn't be accurately targeted, that would appear differently to different reconnaissance methods, that would resist satellite mapping and aerial photography by presenting inconsistent configurations depending on how and when they were observed. The property was a prototype, a proof of concept for what the documents called malleable geography. The institutional period had been about perfecting the technique, about learning how to create and control space that existed in productive quantum uncertainty. The patient files with their generated names weren't patients at all. They were test subjects in experiments designed to understand how human perception and documentation influenced the property's manifestation. The March 1967 deaths weren't deaths, but something else, perhaps transitions, moments when the test subjects became too integrated with the property's impossible nature to exist independently anymore, which suggested a disturbing possibility. The figures I'd been seeing weren't ghosts or hallucinations. They were previous occupants of the property, people who'd become so entangled with its spatial ambiguity that they existed now as features of the landscape rather than as independent entities. Observers who'd become part of what they observed. Surveyors who'd mapped themselves into the territory they documented. I began noticing changes in my own perception. Spatial relationships I'd initially found confusing were becoming intuitive. I could navigate the property's shifting geography without conscious thought, knowing which approach would take me to which version of a structure, understanding instinctively when a path would lead somewhere new versus when it would loop back on itself. I was developing what the research documents had called topological fluency, the ability to operate effectively in impossible space by accepting its impossibility rather than trying to force it into conventional frameworks. This should have concerned me more than it did, but by this point, I'd been on the property long enough that leaving felt more strange than staying. The cottage was comfortable. My work was progressing well. The figures no longer seemed threatening, just additional features to document, elements of the property's ecology that required mapping like any other aspect. When I tried to remember my apartment in Burlington, my life before accepting this commission, the memories felt distant and somewhat abstract, like recollections of someone else's experiences rather than my own history. I completed my field work on what I believed was the final day I'd committed to in my email to Hendrik, though I had no objective way to verify the timeline. I documented hundreds of structures, thousands of spatial relationships, countless instances of impossible geometry and context-dependent geography. I'd filled multiple hard drives with photographs, created database files with tens of thousands of GPS waypoints, recorded hours of video footage and voice observations. I had more than enough material to create a comprehensive map, not a conventional map that claimed definitive accuracy, but a functional map that represented the property's actual nature. I spent the next week, again, measured subjectively rather than objectively, in the cottage, compiling my documentation into final deliverables. The main map took form across multiple layers, each one showing a different aspect of the property's geography. A base layer showing anchor points and stable features, overlay layers showing alternative configurations and context-dependent manifestations, annotation layers explaining the conditions under which different features appeared or relocated. I created a comprehensive legend that explained my mapping methodology and provided guidance for interpreting the unconventional representation. The final map was beautiful in its complexity. It looked like a conventional topographic survey at first glance, but closer examination revealed its true nature, a document that showed impossible space as accurately as impossible space could be shown. I was proud of it in a way I hadn't been proud of any previous work. It was innovative, unprecedented, a genuine contribution to cartographic methodology. It solved a problem that shouldn't exist by accepting the problem's terms, rather than trying to force it into conventional solutions. I packaged the map files and supporting documentation, wrote a comprehensive report explaining my methodology and findings, and prepared everything for transmission to Hendrik Voss. But when I tried to send the files, I found that my internet connection, which had been intermittent but functional, was no longer working at all. My phone showed no signal. My laptop couldn't detect any available networks. I'd completed the work but couldn't deliver it. I decided to drive off the property, find a location with connectivity and transmit the files from there. It seemed straightforward enough. Pack my equipment, load my vehicle, follow the access road back to the county highway. But when I attempted to leave, I found that the access road was no longer where I'd entered. I could see it from the cottage, could walk to its beginning, but when I tried to drive it, my car somehow remained on the property. I would follow the road for what felt like miles, watching the trees pass, only to find myself back at the compound, arriving from a different direction than I'd departed, but definitely back where I'd started. I attempted to leave on foot, hiking out with just a backpack containing the most essential files and equipment. I walked for what must have been hours, following the access road when I could find it, cutting cross-country when the road disappeared. I reached what should have been the property boundary, marked by the stone posts I documented, but passing the boundary didn't take me to the county highway. Instead, I found myself in a section of the property I hadn't encountered before, a cleared area with structures I hadn't documented, a version of the compound that seemed both older and newer than what I'd been surveying. It took me 3 more attempts before I understood. I couldn't leave. Not physically trapped, I could move freely within the property, but unable to exit, unable to transition from this space to normal geography. I'd become too integrated with the impossible space I'd been documenting. My perception had adapted too thoroughly to its logic. I'd achieved the topological fluency I'd recognized in others, but achieving it had bound me to the place that required such fluency. The figures made more sense now. I saw them clearly, recognized their nature. They were previous surveyors, previous occupants, people who'd spent enough time mapping impossible space that they'd become impossible themselves, unable to exist in normal geography, permanent residents of the place they'd tried to document. I was seeing my own future in them, if future was the right word for a condition where time didn't flow in standard directions. I returned to the cottage, accepted my situation with what felt like remarkable calm, but was probably something closer to resignation or inevitability. I couldn't deliver my map to Hendrik Voss directly, but I could leave it where it would be found. I printed physical copies, filed digital copies in multiple locations throughout the property, ensured that my work would be accessible to whoever came next, because someone would come next. The property needed to be mapped periodically, and each mapping required a surveyor willing to spend enough time to understand its nature. The job would be posted, probably by someone like Hendrik Voss, probably with similar vague language about unusual challenges and generous compensation. Someone would accept. Someone would arrive. Someone would begin the same process I'd completed. I found my name on the final map in the map room, the one dated 3 weeks in my future that had been updating itself as I worked. The date had caught up to the present now, though present was increasingly ambiguous as a concept. The map was complete, comprehensive, identical to the final version I'd compiled. My name in the cartographer field was no longer my future but my current state. I'd fulfilled the prophecy by documenting what I'd seen prophesied, a closed temporal loop that made causality impossible to untangle. I've been here for some time now. I'm not certain how long, weeks or months or possibly years, depending on which time measurement you accept. I continue maintaining the maps, updating them as the property changes, preparing documentation for whoever comes next. I see the other surveyors regularly now, understand their routines, occasionally collaborate on documenting features that require multiple observers to manifest completely. We don't speak. Speech doesn't work properly for those of us who have become topologically ambiguous. But we communicate through the maps themselves, through annotations and corrections, through the shared language of cartography adapted to impossible space. I'm writing this account and leaving it in the cottage, in the archive, in multiple locations where a future surveyor will find it. Not as a warning exactly. Warnings only work for people who have the option of heeding them. And by the time you're reading this, you've likely already accepted the commission, already arrived on the property, already begun the process that will integrate you into its geography. Instead, this is documentation, one more map of impossible space, this one showing the subjective territory of what happens to cartographers who map places that resist mapping. The property is still changing, still manifesting new configurations based on how it's observed and documented. Each surveyor adds their own layer to its complexity, their own interpretation to its impossible geography. And somewhere, in some version of the outside world I can barely remember anymore, Hendrik Voss or someone like him is preparing another commission, writing another email, offering another generous fee to document a property with unusual challenges. The maps are here, comprehensive and accurate within their own terms. The property has been surveyed as thoroughly as impossible space can be surveyed. My work is complete, and like all completed work, it has consequences that extend beyond the immediate project. I am those consequences now, embedded in the territory I documented, a feature of the landscape rather than an observer of it. That was 6 months ago, or 6 days, or 6 years. Time doesn't differentiate itself properly anymore, just accumulates in layers like sediment, with no clear delineation between moments. I maintain my routines, update my maps, watch for the next surveyor who will arrive thinking they understand what they've accepted, thinking their professional skills will be sufficient, thinking they can document this place and leave unchanged. The cottage still feels like home, or what home has become, a stable point in unstable geography, an anchor in impossible space. I've expanded my maps to cover areas I'd initially missed, documented features that only revealed themselves after I'd achieved sufficient topological fluency. The property is larger than I initially calculated, or perhaps it's growing, or perhaps size isn't a meaningful measurement for space that exists in productive quantum uncertainty. I see new figures sometimes, observers who aren't yet figures, surveyors still early enough in their integration that they appear solid, that they move with the definite presence of people who still believe in fixed positions and stable geography. I try not to approach them, remembering my own early encounters with the established figures, how unsettling those partial glimpses were. Better to let them discover the property's nature gradually. Let them adapt at their own pace. Let them come to their own understanding of what mapping impossible space requires and costs. The maps I've created are my legacy and my prison, documents that exist in that space between representation and reality, between showing what is and shaping what becomes. They're accurate, and accuracy was what I was hired to provide, what my professional training taught me to prioritize above all other considerations. I succeeded in creating maps that represent impossible space more completely than any previous surveyor managed. I succeeded perfectly. And perfect success in mapping impossible space means becoming impossible yourself, means crossing the boundary between observer and observed, between cartographer and territory. If you're reading this, you're probably experiencing your own version of what I experienced, the gradual realization that the property doesn't conform to standard spatial logic, the growing understanding that documentation efforts seem to influence what's being documented, the uncomfortable awareness that leaving is becoming progressively more difficult. You might think your situation is different, that your methodology will produce different results, that you can complete the survey and depart unchanged. That's what I thought. That's what every surveyor here thought. The property allows for that hope, even encourages it, because hope keeps you working, keeps you documenting, keeps you adding new layers to its ever-expanding complexity. My advice, though advice is probably pointless at this stage, is to embrace the impossibility rather than fighting it. Map what you observe without trying to force it into conventional frameworks. Document the contradictions rather than attempting to resolve them. Accept that cartography in impossible space requires becoming impossible yourself, and that becoming impossible isn't an ending, but a transition to a different mode of existence. The property needs mappers. It thrives on being documented, on having observers who attempt to pin down its ambiguities, and in doing so create new ambiguities that require future documentation. We're part of its ecology now, essential components of its self-perpetuating cycle of observation and manifestation. Our work matters, contributes to something larger than individual surveys, maintains an archive of impossible space that has value even if that value isn't comprehensible to conventional geography. I still receive emails from Hendrik Voss occasionally, though I can't respond, and I'm not certain the emails are actually arriving from outside the property, or are somehow generated by the property itself. They ask about my progress, request updates, remind me of contractual obligations. I assume he's aware of what happens to the surveyors he hires, that the generous fees are compensation not just for difficult work, but for permanent transformation. Or perhaps he genuinely doesn't know, is himself just another feature of the property's system, a mechanism for recruiting new observers, a voice that speaks from nowhere offering opportunities that sound straightforward until you accept them. The next surveyor will arrive eventually. They'll receive their commission, drive the confusing route to the property entrance, find their way through the shifting access road, discover the compound with its impossible buildings and contradictory geography. They'll set up their equipment in the cottage or another structure, begin their documentation efforts, gradually realize that what they're mapping doesn't conform to cartographic principles they've spent careers mastering. They'll find my maps, my documentation, this account. They'll recognize the patterns I recognized, make connections I made, achieve the topological fluency that seals their integration with impossible space. And they'll create their own maps, adding new layers to the archive, documenting features I missed or that manifested only after my integration was complete. The property will expand or contract or maintain stable ambiguity depending on their methodology and expectations. They'll spend what feels like weeks or months completing the survey, deliver or fail to deliver their final documentation, and eventually understand that completion doesn't mean departure, that finishing the map means becoming part of what the map represents. This is what happens to cartographers who map impossible space. We become features of impossible geography, observers so integrated with what we observe that the distinction dissolves. We maintain our routines, update our documentation, wait for the next surveyor in a wait that might be brief or eternal depending on which timeline you follow. We exist in the space between representation and reality, performing the essential work of documenting what resists documentation, mapping what refuses to be fixed in place. The property is still here, still changing, still manifesting according to principles that become more comprehensible the less you insist they conform to normal spatial logic. My maps remain accurate, comprehensive documents of geography that shouldn't exist but does. Representations of impossible space that function precisely because they embrace rather than deny the impossibility. I've learned to navigate the property's ambiguities with something approaching native fluency. I know which approaches lead to which manifestations, understand the patterns that determine when features appear or relocate, recognize the signs that indicate spatial overlap zones where multiple configurations coexist. This knowledge is useful, maybe essential, certainly permanent. It's also isolating, a form of expertise that separates you from anyone who hasn't achieved the same topological adaptation. Sometimes I stand at the edge of the compound and look toward where the county highway should be, trying to remember what traffic sounds like, what it feels like to exist in space that has definite edges and fixed positions. The memories are abstract now, concepts I understand intellectually but can't quite recall experiencing. Normal geography has become the impossibility, the configuration that seems implausible when you've adapted to a place where everything depends on context and observation. The work continues. New areas require documentation. Seasonal changes, if seasonal, is meaningful for a place where time doesn't flow consistently, alter the property's manifestation in ways that need to be mapped. Other surveyors who have achieved integration collaborate on projects too complex for individual observation, combining our different perspectives to document features that require multiple simultaneous viewpoints to comprehend. We're building something here, though I'm not certain what. An archive of impossible space, a methodology for representing what resists representation, a community of observers who have crossed the boundary between subject and object, who exist now as both cartographers and territory. The property contains us, and we contain the property, a mutual relationship that defies normal categories of containment and separation. The map dated 3 weeks in my future, the one that troubled me so much during my initial survey, hangs in the map room still. My name remains in the cartographer field, but other names have appeared below it. Future surveyors whose maps haven't been created yet, whose integration hasn't occurred yet, whose names somehow appear in documentation from their own futures. The property operates outside normal temporal flow, affects preceding causes, futures shaping pasts, documentation existing before the observations it supposedly records. I add my updates to the archive regularly, maintaining the professional habits I developed over years of conventional cartography. Precision matters even in impossible space, perhaps especially in impossible space, where the absence of fixed reference points makes careful measurement even more critical. My maps are accurate, and accuracy has been my guiding principle throughout my career, the standard I've held myself to regardless of challenging circumstances. That accuracy cost me the ability to leave, to exist in normal geography, to maintain the identity I had before accepting this commission. But it produced maps that actually work, that provide genuine utility for navigating impossible space, that represent the property's nature rather than forcing it into inappropriate frameworks. I succeeded at what I was hired to do. The fact that success meant permanent integration doesn't change the quality of the work. This account will remain in the cottage, in the archive, in multiple locations throughout the property. Future surveyors will find it at various points in their own integration process. Some will read it as warning, some as instruction, some as confirmation of patterns they're already recognizing. The property ensures its documentation reaches those who need to encounter it, arranging discoveries according to principles I don't fully understand despite years of observation. The figures gather sometimes in the clearing near the main house, a dozen or more of us standing in formations that might be social or might serve some purpose specific to topologically ambiguous entities. We don't speak. Our adaptation has progressed beyond speech, but we communicate through presence and position, through the shared understanding of observers who have become observed, cartographers who have become geography. I am part of the property now, a permanent feature of its impossible landscape, a resource for future surveyors, a name in the cartographer field of maps that document space that shouldn't exist. My work continues, updating the archive, maintaining accuracy, ensuring that the documentation remains comprehensive and current. This is what remains after integration. The work itself, stripped of external purpose, continuing simply because it continues, because documenting impossible space is what I do now, what I am now, what I'll remain being for however long duration has meaning in a place where time flows in multiple directions simultaneously. The property waits for its next surveyor. The commission will be offered. Someone will accept. The cycle will continue, adding new layers to an archive that grows without filling, that expands without boundaries, that accumulates documentation of impossible space from observers who become impossible themselves through the act of observation. And somewhere, In the normal geography I can barely remember. Maps are being consulted. Boundaries are being disputed. Properties are being surveyed by cartographers who work in space that stays fixed when you measure it, who complete their projects and move on to new assignments, who never encounter places that require you to become impossible to map them accurately. That world continues without me, oblivious to impossible geography, operating according to spatial principles that seem quaint now, unnecessarily restrictive, a simplification of possibilities that exist when you allow space to be ambiguous. I don't miss it, or I do miss it, but the missing is abstract, disconnected from actual longing. I exist here now, in impossible space, as a feature of the territory I documented. The maps are my legacy. This account is my warning and my instruction. The property is my home and my career and my permanent condition. The work is complete. The work is never complete. The work continues exactly as long as it needs to continue, which is forever or until the next surveyor arrives to add their layer to the archive, whichever comes first or last or simultaneously. I've been maintaining the maps for what might be decades now, or days. The distinction has lost whatever meaning it once held. My equipment still functions, batteries charging from sources I've stopped questioning, data transferring between devices that shouldn't maintain connectivity but do. The professional habits persist even as the professional identity that developed them becomes increasingly abstract. New surveyors arrive with decreasing frequency, or perhaps with increasing frequency, and my perception of time has deteriorated enough that I can't accurately track the intervals. I see them in their early days on the property, watch them progress through the same stages of confusion and adaptation I experienced. Sometimes I leave notes for them, additions to this account, warnings that become less urgent with each iteration, because I understand now that warnings can't prevent what accepting the commission already guarantees. The property has expanded since my integration, or I've become aware of expansions that existed before, but required sufficient topological fluency to proceed. There are sections now that exist primarily in documentation, areas that manifest only when someone consults the maps showing them, geography that depends entirely on being observed through cartographic representation to achieve any form of presence. I map these sections carefully, maintaining accuracy even for features that exist solely as information rather than as physical space. The institutional researchers were trying to weaponize this, trying to create strategic geography that would resist enemy mapping and targeting. They succeeded more thoroughly than they intended, creating space that resists all mapping attempts by integrating the mappers themselves, by transforming documentation efforts into permanent occupation. The property became the ultimate defense, not by being difficult to map, but by ensuring that anyone who maps it can never leave to share what they've learned. I understand the mechanism now, the process by which observation becomes integration. Space that exists in quantum superposition requires observers to collapse the waveform, to select which configuration manifests through the act of measurement. But when the superposition is sufficiently complex, when the number of possible configurations exceeds what human consciousness can process without adaptation, the observer must change rather than the observed. You develop topological fluency to navigate impossible space, and developing that fluency means your neural architecture rewrites itself to accommodate spatial principles that normal brains reject as impossible. Once rewritten, you can't exist in normal space anymore. Your perceptual system requires the ambiguity, depends on context-dependent geography, fails to function in places where position and distance remain fixed. This is what I've become, a consciousness adapted to impossible space, unable to process normal geography, permanently bound to the territory I documented. My maps are accurate because I perceive the property as it actually functions rather than as simplified versions that ignore inconvenient impossibilities. But that accuracy required transformation, required becoming something other than what I was when I arrived. The other surveyors understand. We exist together in our separate integrations, each of us maintaining our section of the archive, each of us serving the property's need for continuous documentation. We're not prisoners. The property doesn't constrain us through force or barriers. We simply can't exist anywhere else anymore. We've adapted too thoroughly to impossible space to survive in possible geography. I still receive emails from Hendrik Voss occasionally, though I've long since stopped trying to respond. They follow the same patterns: requests for updates, questions about timeline, assurances that unconventional results are acceptable. I wonder sometimes if he's another integrated surveyor, if his role is to recruit new observers from within impossible space, if the emails I received before accepting the commission originated from someone like me rather than from anyone in the normal world. The property needs new surveyors periodically, needs fresh perspectives to document configurations that require different observational frameworks to manifest. Someone must recruit them. Perhaps that becomes my role eventually, sending commissions to cartographers in normal geography, offering generous fees for surveys of properties that resist conventional mapping. The work continues because the work is all that continues. Identity fades without external reference points, without social contexts that reinforce stable self-conception. I am my function now, cartographer of impossible space, maintainer of archives that document what shouldn't exist, resource for future surveyors who will follow the same trajectory I followed. The person I was before accepting this commission exists only in memories that feel increasingly fictional. Stories I tell myself about someone who might have been me, or might have been any of the other integrated surveyors, whose early histories follow similar patterns. The property grows, or my perception of it expands, or the difference between growth and expanded perception becomes meaningless when you exist in space that manifests according to observational frameworks. New structures appear, new roads connect previously separate areas, new configurations emerge that require documentation. The work never completes because completion would imply fixed boundaries and stable features, conditions impossible in space that exists in permanent superposition. I add this final section to my account knowing it won't be final, knowing I'll continue adding updates as long as some version of my identity persists, as long as the habits of documentation remain more durable than the self that developed them. Future surveyors will find these additions scattered throughout the property, will read them at different points in their integration, will recognize their own trajectory in the progression from confident professional to confused observer to integrated feature of impossible geography. The maps are here, comprehensive and accurate and eternally incomplete. The property is here, impossible and real and requiring continuous documentation. I am here, somewhere between cartographer and territory, between observer and observed, between the person I was and the function I've become. The work continues. The property manifests. The archive expands. The next surveyor approaches, driving uncertain roads toward a commission they think they understand. toward impossible space that understands them better than they understand themselves. That was my trajectory. That is every surveyor's trajectory here. That will be the trajectory of whoever comes next, reading this account in the cottage or the archive, or wherever the property decides they need to find it, recognizing the patterns they're already experiencing, understanding too late or exactly on time that mapping impossible space means becoming impossible yourself, means crossing boundaries that don't allow return, means achieving accuracy at the cost of everything except the work itself. The property waits. The commission will be offered. Someone will accept. And the archive will gain another layer, another perspective, another observer transformed into observed, another cartographer who discovered that some territories map back,